There are sounds that follow you home from places where the dead refuse to rest quietly. My name doesn't matter anymore, but what I'm about to tell you happened at Greenlawn Cemetery, where I worked as a night groundskeeper for exactly 17 days before I understood why the position had been vacant for 8 months. Most people assume cemetery work is peaceful, perhaps even meditative. But those people have never walked alone through rows of headstones when the moon disappears behind. Storm clouds and something that shouldn't exist begin scratching at the earth from below. Tonight, I'll share 4 true accounts that will challenge everything you believe about death, burial, and the thin barrier between this world and whatever lies beneath our feet. These aren't stories designed for entertainment or cheap thrills. They're warnings carved from real experiences that left permanent scars on those who lived to tell them. The first involves a leather-bound journal I discovered in the groundskeeper's shed, its pages filled with entries that documented the impossible, written in increasingly desperate handwriting that deteriorated with each passing night shift. The second comes from a photographer whose assignment to document historic cemeteries revealed something stalking him through developed film, something that refused to remain confined to cemetery grounds. The third belongs to a genealogist whose innocent family research uncovered a conspiracy of falsified death records and graves that contained the wrong bodies, leading to a discovery about her own predetermined fate. The fourth and final account comes from a security guard whose routine patrols at Millbrook Cemetery exposed an underground horror that the cemetery board had been covering up for decades. If these stories disturb your sleep tonight, perhaps that's exactly what needs to happen, because ignorance won't protect you when you inevitably find yourself alone in a cemetery after dark. Before we begin, I need you to subscribe to ensure these testimonies reach others who need to hear them, because some truths are too dangerous to let die with their witnesses. Can you tell me what connects all 4 of these locations, aside from their purpose as final resting places for the dead? The first person to answer correctly will receive a small reward from me, the storyteller tonight, as a way of saying thank you for watching and supporting. Also, let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching this and your location. I'm curious to know how far these stories are traveling across the world as people discover them. But now, let's step into the darkness together, where the dead have stories of their own to tell. I found Marcus Holloway's journal on my first night at Greenlawn Cemetery, tucked behind a rusted toolbox in the maintenance shed like he'd hidden it there deliberately, knowing someone would eventually need to understand what he'd experienced during his time as head groundskeeper. The leather cover was water-stained and warped, filled with entries spanning 6 months of night shifts that began with routine observations about cemetery maintenance and gradually descended into documentation of phenomena that defied rational explanation. Marcus had started working at Greenlawn in March, taking over from the previous groundskeeper who had simply stopped showing up for work without giving notice or collecting his final paycheck. His early entries read like standard maintenance. Logs, noting broken sprinklers, vandalized headstones, and occasional encounters with teenagers sneaking in after hours to drink beer and scare each other with ghost stories. But by his 3rd week, Marcus began documenting irregularities that troubled him, starting with graves in Section D that appeared to have been disturbed despite no scheduled exhumations or burials. The soil around certain headstones looked freshly turned, darker and more loosely packed than the surrounding earth, even though cemetery records showed no activity in that area for months. Marcus initially attributed this to natural settling, or perhaps animals, but his entries reveal growing unease as he noticed the pattern repeating itself night after night, always in the same graves, always during his shift. Marcus's entries from April revealed that the disturbed graves weren't random occurrences but followed a specific pattern that became impossible to ignore once he started mapping their locations on cemetery blueprints. The affected graves formed a rough circle around the oldest section of Greenlawn, where burials dated back to the 1800s and headstones had weathered into illegible gray monuments to forgotten names. He wrote about finding fresh dirt scattered around headstones that hadn't been touched by groundskeeping equipment, with clumps of earth that seemed to have been pushed up from below rather than disturbed from above. The most unsettling discovery came when Marcus compared his nightly observations with cemetery records and realized that the graves showing signs of disturbance belonged to people who had been buried at least 60 years ago, their caskets supposedly resting 6 feet down in soil that should have been permanently settled. But every morning, Marcus would find evidence that something had been moving beneath those graves during the night, creating small mounds of displaced earth and leaving depressions in the grass that looked like handprints pressed into the sod. His journal entries describe using a metal probe to test the soil consistency around the disturbed graves, expecting to find solid, compacted earth that would indicate stable, undisturbed burial sites. Instead, the probe sank deeper than it should have, encountering pockets of loose soil and empty spaces that suggested the ground beneath had been hollowed out or extensively disturbed from below. Marcus began staying later into his shifts, hiding behind the maintenance shed with binoculars to observe the cemetery during the darkest hours between midnight and dawn, hoping to catch whatever was causing the disturbances. His entries from late April describe a night when he watched Section D for 3 hours straight, seeing nothing unusual until approximately 2:47 a.m. when the ground around the Whitmore family plot began to shift and ripple like water. He wrote about soil moving in waves, creating small hills and valleys across the grass surface, accompanied by a sound he described as fabric tearing, mixed with someone taking deep, labored breaths. The disturbance lasted for nearly 20 minutes, before the ground settled back to its normal appearance, leaving behind the familiar pattern of displaced earth and depression marks that Marcus had been documenting for weeks. He attempted to investigate the area immediately after the disturbance ended, but his flashlight beam revealed something that made him retreat to the safety of the shed and spend the remainder of his shift writing frantically in his journal. The depression marks weren't random shapes pressed into the soil. They were clearly defined handprints and what appeared to be knee impressions, as if someone had been crawling across the ground above the graves. But the prints were too large to belong to any living person Marcus had ever encountered, with fingers that extended nearly 8 inches from palm to tip and spaces between digits that suggested joints capable of unnatural flexibility. The journal entry for that night ends abruptly mid-sentence, with ink smeared across the page as if Marcus had been interrupted while writing and never returned to complete his thoughts. The entries from May revealed that Marcus had begun hearing sounds during his night shifts that complemented the visual disturbances he'd been documenting. Sounds that seemed to originate from deep beneath the cemetery grounds and grew more distinct as spring temperatures warmed the earth. He described a rhythmic tapping that reminded him of fingernails drumming against wood, always coming from the direction of the oldest graves, but echoing through the ground in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the exact source. The tapping would begin around midnight and continue intermittently throughout his shift, sometimes accompanied by what sounded like muffled conversations carried through soil and stone, too distant and distorted to understand but clearly involving multiple voices engaged in urgent discussion. Marcus purchased a sensitive recording device to capture these sounds, hoping to play them back during daylight hours when rational thought might help him interpret what he was experiencing. His journal includes detailed descriptions of the playback sessions, where he discovered that the tapping sounds formed patterns that repeated every 17 minutes, like a coded message being transmitted through the earth. The muffled voices became clearer when he amplified the recordings and adjusted the frequency ranges, revealing fragments of conversation that seemed to involve people discussing their current situations and expressing concern about something approaching or changing in their environment. But the most disturbing aspect of these recordings was that Marcus began recognizing names mentioned in the conversations, names that matched headstones in the cemetery's oldest sections, as if the voices belonged to people who had been buried decades ago but remained conscious and aware in their graves. He started bringing a shovel to work, driven by compulsion to excavate one of the disturbed graves and discover what was actually buried beneath the soil that moved and shifted during his night shifts. Marcus chose the Whitmore plot for his unauthorized investigation, reasoning that the family had been dead for over 70 years and no living relatives would notice if their grave was temporarily disturbed. His journal entry for May 15th describes digging through earth that felt strangely warm and soft, requiring far less effort than he'd expected for soil that should have been compacted by decades of settling. At approximately 3 feet down, his shovel struck something that wasn't wood or metal, something that yielded under pressure but pushed back when he tried to lift it free from the surrounding dirt. Marcus wrote about clearing away more soil to expose what appeared to be fabric, dark material that looked like burial clothing but felt wrong somehow, too thick and substantial for typical funeral attire. When he pulled the fabric aside to examine what lay beneath, Marcus discovered that the Whitmore grave didn't contain a human body at all, but rather an intricate network of tunnels that extended horizontally through the earth, connecting with other graves and forming an underground system that explained how sounds and movement could travel between burial sites. The tunnels were lined with the same dark fabric he'd initially mistaken for burial clothes, creating a soft-walled passage system that muffled sound while allowing communication between different sections of the cemetery. His journal entry ends with a single line written in shaking handwriting that Marcus had circled multiple times with his pen, and he stops there forevermore. Marcus's final journal entry was dated May 18th, written in handwriting that had deteriorated, from his usual neat script into barely legible scrawl that suggested either extreme haste or fear-induced trembling that made it difficult for him to control his pen. The entry began with a warning directed at whoever might find the journal, stating that anyone who discovered the underground tunnel system should leave Greenlawn Cemetery immediately and never return, because what lived in those passages wasn't content to remain hidden beneath the earth. Marcus wrote about returning to the Whitmore grave the night after his initial excavation, finding that someone or something had filled in the hole he'd dug and replaced the disturbed soil with earth that looked like it had never been touched. But when he pressed his ear to the ground above the grave, Marcus could hear movement in the tunnels below, along with sounds that suggested the underground network was expanding, with new passages being carved through the earth during the hours. Between his shifts, he described attempting to map the tunnel system by following the sounds and vibrations that traveled through the ground, discovering that the passages extended far beyond the cemetery boundaries and connected to other locations throughout the town that had once been burial sites or places where people had died violently. The journal entry reveals that Marcus had contacted the cemetery board to report his discoveries, only to be told that he was experiencing stress-related hallucinations and should consider taking time off to recover his mental stability. But, instead of dismissing his concerns, the board members seemed unusually interested in the specific locations where Marcus had observed disturbances, asking detailed questions about which graves were affected and whether he had disturbed the soil in any areas. Their response convinced Marcus that the cemetery administration was already aware of the tunnel system and had been covering up its existence, possibly for decades, which explained why the groundskeeper position had remained vacant for so long, and why previous employees had disappeared without explanation. The final paragraphs of Marcus's journal describe his decision to continue documenting the phenomena despite official pressure to ignore what he'd witnessed, because he believed the tunnel network was expanding toward residential areas and posed a threat to people living near the cemetery. He wrote about detecting new sounds during his final shift, sounds that suggested the passages had reached beyond the cemetery perimeter and were now extending beneath homes and businesses in the surrounding neighborhood. The journal entry concludes with Marcus stating his intention to gather physical evidence of the tunnel system and present it to local authorities, but warning that if anything happened to him, whoever found his journal should continue his investigation and expose the truth about what was living beneath Greenlawn Cemetery. The last line of the entry reads, written in increasingly frantic handwriting, "They know I've found them, and now they're coming up tonight to make sure I never tell anyone about the tunnels. but I've hidden this journal where someone will find it and understand that death at Green Lawn doesn't mean rest. It means joining whatever builds those passages in the dark. Marcus Holloway was never seen again after that final entry, and when the cemetery board hired me as his replacement 17, days later, they never mentioned finding his body or determining what had happened to him during his last shift at Green Lawn. Story 2. The Photographer's Evidence. David Chen had built his reputation as a freelance photographer by specializing in historical documentation, traveling across the northeastern United States to capture images of forgotten landmarks, abandoned buildings, and century-old cemeteries that told the visual story of America's past through weathered stone and crumbling architecture. His assignment at Riverside Memorial Park seemed routine when he received the commission from a genealogical society that wanted professional photographs of their members' ancestral burial sites for a commemorative book project. The cemetery, dated back to 1847 and contained over 3,000 graves spread across rolling hills that overlooked a river valley, creating a picturesque setting that should have yielded beautiful, melancholic images perfect for historical preservation. David arrived at Riverside Memorial Park on a crisp October afternoon, when the autumn light filtered through maple trees and cast long shadows between headstones, conditions that should have been ideal for the atmospheric photography that had made his reputation. He spent several hours during daylight familiarizing himself with the cemetery layout, noting interesting architectural details on mausoleums and monuments that would make compelling subjects for his camera, while also identifying the specific graves mentioned in his client's list of burial sites that required documentation. But David preferred to work during the golden hours just before sunset when the light became soft and dramatic, so he planned to return that evening to capture the majority of his photographs when the lighting conditions would enhance the emotional impact of the images. When David returned to Riverside Memorial Park at dusk, the cemetery had transformed from a peaceful historical site into something that felt subtly menacing, with shadows that seemed deeper than they should have been, and areas between headstones that appeared to shift and move when viewed through his camera's viewfinder. He attributed these impressions to the natural anxiety that came with working alone in a cemetery after dark, combined with the way his mind processed the unfamiliar environment through the narrow field of view provided by his telephoto lens. David methodically worked through his shot list, photographing individual headstones and family plots while using long exposures to capture the ambient light that remained in the sky as full darkness settled over the cemetery grounds. His camera equipment included high-end digital sensors capable of detecting light levels far below what the human eye could perceive, allowing him to capture detail in shadows and dark areas that appeared completely black to normal vision. But as David worked deeper into the cemetery, reviewing images on his camera's LCD screen between shots, he began noticing anomalies in the photographs that hadn't been visible when he composed the images through his viewfinder. In several shots of the older section of the cemetery, dark shapes appeared to be standing behind headstones or positioned between trees, shapes that looked like human silhouettes, but had been completely invisible when David had taken the photographs. Initially, he assumed these were photographic artifacts caused by long exposure times or digital noise generated by his camera's high ISO settings, but the shapes appeared consistently in multiple images and seemed to occupy logical positions, relative to the cemetery landscape, rather than appearing as random technical glitches. David's concern about the mysterious shapes in his photographs intensified when he returned to his studio and began processing the raw image files through professional editing software that allowed him to examine every pixel of his cemetery photographs in high-resolution detail. The dark silhouettes that had appeared as vague shapes on his camera's small LCD screen became clearly defined human figures when displayed on his large computer monitor, figures that showed remarkable detail despite having been invisible to David's eyes when he composed the shots. The figures appeared to be wearing period clothing that matched the historical era of the cemetery's oldest sections, with some dressed in Victorian-era funeral attire while others wore more modern clothing that corresponded to burial dates from the 1940s and 1950s. Each figure seemed to be positioned in a logical relationship to specific graves, either standing directly behind headstones or positioned as if emerging from burial sites, but their poses suggested awareness of David's presence and interest in his photographic activities. David initially considered the possibility that other people had been in the cemetery during his shooting session, visitors who had somehow escaped his notice while he focused on his camera work, but careful analysis of the lighting and shadow patterns in his photographs proved that theory impossible. The figures cast no shadows despite being illuminated by the same ambient light sources that affected everything else in the images, and their positioning often placed them in areas where David would have necessarily seen them while setting up his shots. More disturbing was the fact that several figures appeared to be looking directly toward David's camera position, their faces turned toward the lens with expressions that suggested they were aware of being photographed and were posing for the images. David decided to return to Riverside Memorial Park during daylight hours to investigate the specific locations where the figures had appeared in his photographs, hoping to find evidence that might explain their presence or reveal environmental factors that could have created optical illusions. But when he compared his photographs with the actual cemetery locations, David discovered that the figures had been standing in positions that would have been impossible for living people to occupy, some appearing to emerge from solid granite monuments while others seemed to be positioned partially below ground level. The most unsettling discovery came when David used his photographs to identify specific graves associated with the mysterious figures, cross-referencing headstone inscriptions with cemetery records to determine who was buried at each location. In every case, the appearance and clothing of the figures in his photographs matched historical descriptions and burial records of the people interred at those grave sites, as if the dead were appearing in his images wearing the same clothing. They had been buried in decades or centuries earlier. David began developing a theory that his high-sensitivity camera equipment was somehow capturing visual phenomena that existed beyond the normal spectrum of human perception, recording images of deceased individuals who maintained some form of presence in the cemetery where their bodies were buried. But this theory became more complicated when David examined the metadata embedded in his digital files and discovered that several images contained more figures than he had initially noticed, suggesting that his photographs were revealing an entire community of deceased individuals who were active and aware in Riverside Memorial Park. David's investigation of the mysterious cemetery photographs took a terrifying turn when he began finding similar unexplained figures appearing in images he took at completely different locations, always in the background or periphery of shots that had nothing to do with cemeteries or burial sites. A photograph of his own apartment building revealed a Victorian-era woman standing on the fire escape outside his bedroom window, her face clearly visible and turned toward his camera with the same aware expression he had documented at Riverside Memorial Park. An image of his neighborhood coffee shop showed a man in 1940s military uniform sitting at a corner table that had been empty when David composed the shot, the figure's transparent form barely visible but undeniably present when the photograph was analyzed in detail. The pattern continued across dozens of images taken over several weeks following his cemetery assignment, with deceased individuals from Riverside Memorial Park apparently following David through his daily routine and appearing in photographs regardless of where or when they were taken. David realized that his high-sensitivity camera wasn't just documenting supernatural activity at the cemetery, but had somehow attracted the attention of deceased individuals who were now stalking him through both photographic and physical realms. The figures began appearing in images taken inside David's apartment, showing deceased individuals standing in his living room, kitchen, and bedroom at times when he knew for certain that no one else was present in the building. Some photographs revealed multiple figures gathered around David while he slept, their faces showing expressions of curiosity or concern as they observed his unconscious form from various angles around his bed. The most disturbing images showed the figures apparently communicating with each other, their body language suggesting conversation and interaction, despite their inability to make sounds that David could hear with normal perception. David attempted to research the identities of the figures following him, using his cemetery photographs and cemetery records to learn about the deceased individuals who had apparently taken an interest in his life and activities. He discovered that many of the figures came from families that had experienced tragic or violent deaths, including several suicide victims, accident casualties, and at least one confirmed murder victim whose killer had never been identified by police. The common thread connecting these deceased individuals seemed to be unresolved issues or unfinished business that had prevented them from achieving peaceful rest, suggesting that David's photographs had somehow created a connection between the living and dead that allowed communication across the barrier of death. But as the supernatural stalking intensified, David began experiencing physical manifestations of the phenomena that had previously been limited to photographic evidence, including cold spots in his apartment that moved and followed him from room to room, electronic devices that activated by themselves in patterns that seemed intentionally communicative, and objects that moved when he wasn't looking directly at them but remained stationary when observed through his camera viewfinder. The final photograph in David's collection shows his own reflection in his bathroom mirror, but standing directly behind him are dozens of the deceased figures from Riverside Memorial Park, their faces pressed close to his shoulders and neck, as if whispering secrets that only the dead can know, while David's expression in the mirror shows the exhausted, haunted look of someone who understands that some assignments follow you home and never end, even when you stop taking pictures. Story 3. The genealogist's research Margaret Sullivan had dedicated 15 years of her retirement to researching family genealogy, using online databases, historical records, and cemetery visits to trace her ancestral connections back through generations of Irish immigrants who had settled in New England during the 1800s. Her interest in family history had begun as a casual hobby, but evolved into an obsession with uncovering every detail about her lineage, including the locations of ancestral burial sites and the circumstances surrounding her relatives' deaths. Margaret's research had led her to Hillside Cemetery in rural Massachusetts, where genealogical records indicated that multiple generations of the Sullivan family had been buried in a family plot that dated back to the cemetery's founding in 1834. She planned to visit the cemetery to photograph the headstones and gather information that would complete her family tree, expecting to find a peaceful conclusion to years of painstaking research into her family's history. But when Margaret arrived at Hillside Cemetery and located the Sullivan family plot using a cemetery map provided by the administrative office, she discovered discrepancies between the burial records and the actual grave markers that suggested serious errors in the cemetery's record-keeping system. The headstones displayed death dates that preceded the official burial records by decades, with some graves showing death years that occurred before the cemetery had even been established. Margaret initially assumed she had located the wrong burial section, or that the cemetery office had provided incorrect information about her family's plot location, but careful examination of the headstone inscriptions confirmed that these were indeed her relatives with names and family relationships that matched her genealogical research perfectly. The discrepancies became more troubling when Margaret compared the death dates carved into the headstones with historical records she had gathered from vital statistics offices, newspapers, and church records. According to her research, Patrick Sullivan had died in 1847 from consumption, but his headstone displayed a death date of 1823, 14 years earlier than any historical record indicated. Mary Sullivan's official death certificate listed her passing as 1852 due to childbirth complications, but her grave marker showed 1831 as her death year. The pattern continued across every grave in the family plot, with headstone dates consistently showing deaths that had occurred 20 to 25 years earlier than documented historical records. Margaret contacted the cemetery office to report the discrepancies and request access to original burial records that might explain the conflicting dates, but the staff seemed strangely reluctant to discuss the Sullivan family plot or provide historical documentation about their burial arrangements. When Margaret insisted on examining the cemetery's historical records, she was told that many documents had been lost in a fire decades earlier and that current staff had no knowledge of specific burial details for graves older than 50 years. But the administrative assistant's nervous behavior and frequent glances toward a locked filing cabinet suggested that records did exist, but were being deliberately withheld from public access. Margaret decided to conduct her own investigation by researching other families buried in Hillside Cemetery's older sections, hoping to determine whether the date discrepancies affected only her relatives or represented a broader pattern of record-keeping, errors that might have a logical explanation. Margaret's investigation of other burial records at Hillside Cemetery revealed that the date discrepancies weren't isolated to her family plot, but represented a systematic pattern of falsified death records that affected dozens of graves throughout the cemetery's oldest sections. She discovered that virtually every headstone dating from the cemetery's founding period displayed death dates that preceded official vital statistics records by 20 to 30 years, suggesting that either the headstone carving had been systematically incorrect or the official death records had been deliberately falsified to conceal the actual timing of deaths. Margaret began documenting these discrepancies with photographs and detailed notes, creating a comprehensive database that showed the extent of the record-keeping irregularities while also revealing troubling patterns in the types of deaths that had been misdated. The families affected by the date discrepancies had all died during the same approximate time period in the 1820s and 1830s, but according to official records, these deaths had been spread out over several decades and attributed to common causes like disease, old age, and accidents. Margaret's research suggested that a significant number of people had actually died during a much shorter time frame than official records indicated, possibly during some kind of epidemic or catastrophic event that had been covered up or minimized in historical documentation. The most disturbing discovery came when Margaret began researching the actual burial locations within the affected graves, using ground-penetrating radar equipment borrowed from a geological survey company to examine what was actually buried beneath the headstones. The radar readings revealed that many graves contained multiple sets of remains, rather than the single bodies indicated by the headstone inscriptions, with some burial sites showing evidence of mass interments that included significantly more bodies than could be accounted for by the marked grave locations. Margaret realized that Hillside Cemetery wasn't just guilty of inaccurate record-keeping, but was actively concealing evidence of mass deaths that had occurred during the cemetery's early years, possibly to protect the reputation of the town or cover up negligence that had led to preventable casualties. She attempted to contact local historical societies and genealogical organizations to report her findings, but discovered that several researchers had previously investigated similar discrepancies at Hillside Cemetery and had either abandoned their research without explanation or had their findings dismissed as inconsequential clerical errors. Margaret's inquiry letters to these previous researchers went unanswered, and when she attempted to contact them by phone, she learned that several had died unexpectedly shortly after concluding their cemetery research, while others had moved away from the area without leaving forwarding addresses. The pattern of silenced researchers convinced Margaret that someone or some organization was actively working to suppress information about Hillside Cemetery's true history, but her determination to uncover the truth only intensified as she realized that her own family had been victims of whatever conspiracy had created the falsified records. Margaret's investigation took a personal turn when she discovered a section of cemetery records that had been accidentally misfiled and escaped the document destruction that had eliminated most historical evidence, records that revealed the true scope of the cover-up and identified her own family members as witnesses to events that powerful people had wanted forgotten. Margaret's examination of the misfiled cemetery records revealed documentation that contradicted everything she believed about her family history and exposed a conspiracy that had been maintained for over 150 years to conceal mass deaths that had occurred during Hillside Cemetery's early years. The records described a cholera epidemic that had swept through the town in 1823, killing over 200 people in a matter of weeks, but official town records had systematically redistributed these death dates across several decades to minimize the appearance of a public health catastrophe that could have damaged the community's reputation and economic prospects. Margaret's Sullivan ancestors hadn't died of natural causes spread out over many years, as she had believed, but had all perished during the epidemic along with most of their neighbors, their bodies hastily buried in mass graves that were later covered with individual headstones to create the illusion of normal, spaced-out family deaths. The most shocking revelation came when Margaret found her own name listed in the cemetery records, not as a researcher or visitor, but as a scheduled burial with a death date that was only 3 weeks in the future from the day she discovered the documents. According to the records, Margaret Sullivan was destined to die on November 15th and would be buried in the family plot alongside her ancestors, with her death attributed to natural causes despite her current good health and active lifestyle. The record entry included specific details about her funeral arrangements, burial location, and even the text that would be carved on her headstone, suggesting that someone had been planning her death and had already made preparations for her burial at Hillside Cemetery. Margaret realized that her genealogical research had uncovered information that someone was willing to kill to protect, and that her investigation into the falsified death records had marked her as a threat that needed to be eliminated before she could expose the truth about the cemetery's history. She attempted to leave Hillside Cemetery immediately after discovering the records that predicted her death. Margaret's investigation had revealed that the Hillside Cemetery conspiracy extended far beyond falsified death records and involved a systematic pattern of eliminating anyone who discovered the truth about the mass deaths that had been concealed for over 150 years. Her research into previous genealogists and historians who had investigated the cemetery showed that 12 researchers had died under suspicious circumstances within months of uncovering evidence about the cholera epidemic cover-up. Their deaths, attributed to accidents, sudden illnesses, and suicides that had prevented them from publishing their findings or sharing their discoveries with the public. The cemetery records that Margaret had found contained detailed files on each of these researchers, including surveillance notes about their investigation methods, personal information about their families and daily routines, and specific plans for their elimination that had been carried out with precision that suggested professional execution. Margaret realized that she had stumbled into a conspiracy that involved not just cemetery administrators, but local government officials, historical societies, and possibly law enforcement agencies that had been working together for generations to protect the secret of what had really happened during the 1823 epidemic. The record suggested that the cholera outbreak hadn't been a natural disaster, but had resulted from deliberate negligence or possibly intentional poisoning that had targeted specific families and ethnic groups within the community, making it a mass murder that powerful families had covered up to protect their reputations and economic interests. Margaret's family hadn't just been victims of disease, but had been targeted for elimination, along with other Irish immigrants who had been viewed as threats to the established social order of the town. The conspiracy had persisted across multiple generations because the descendants of the original perpetrators had inherited both the wealth gained from their ancestors' crimes and the responsibility for maintaining the cover-up that protected their family legacies. Margaret's genealogical research had threatened to expose not just the falsified death records, but the ongoing conspiracy that continued to eliminate threats to the secret that had been maintained for over a century. As Margaret tried to escape from Hillside Cemetery, she realized that the fog surrounding her wasn't a natural weather phenomenon but was being artificially generated to prevent her from leaving the grounds until the conspirators could arrive to implement the death date that had been scheduled for her in the cemetery records. Her phone captured audio recordings of vehicles arriving at the cemetery entrance and footsteps approaching through the fog, along with radio communications between multiple individuals who were coordinating their search for her location within the cemetery grounds. The voices she had initially mistaken for her deceased relatives calling her name were actually living people using electronic devices to project sound from different locations, creating the illusion of supernatural activity. While they systematically searched the cemetery to locate and eliminate her before she could escape with evidence of their conspiracy. Margaret's final transmission, sent as a voice message to her daughter's phone, revealed that she had hidden copies of the cemetery records in multiple locations and had already uploaded digital copies to cloud storage accounts that would automatically release the information if she failed to check in within 48 hours, ensuring that her death wouldn't prevent the truth about Hillside Cemetery from eventually being exposed to the public. Story 4. The Night Security Incident. Kevin Rodriguez had worked security for 8 years at various commercial and industrial locations throughout the state, but his assignment at Millbrook Cemetery represented his first experience guarding a burial ground, a job that paid significantly more than typical security work, but came with no clear explanation for why a cemetery would require round-the-clock protection. The cemetery administrator had mentioned concerns about vandalism and theft during Kevin's brief orientation, but Millbrook Cemetery was located in a quiet suburban area with low crime rates and showed no evidence of previous damage to headstones, monuments, or mausoleums that would justify the expense of hiring professional security services. Kevin's responsibilities included patrolling the cemetery grounds every 2 hours throughout his 12-hour overnight shift, checking that gates and buildings remained secure, and documenting any unusual activity in daily reports that were collected each morning by cemetery staff who seemed unusually interested in the specific details of his observations. During his first week at Millbrook Cemetery, Kevin noticed that fresh flowers appeared regularly on graves throughout the cemetery, but these floral arrangements were being placed during his overnight shifts by visitors who somehow managed to enter and exit the cemetery without being detected, despite his regular patrols and the security cameras positioned at all entrance points. The flowers weren't random selections from a florist, but were specific varieties that matched the seasons and personal preferences documented in burial records, suggesting that whoever was placing them had intimate knowledge of the deceased individuals and their families' traditions. Kevin initially assumed that family members were somehow accessing the cemetery during his rounds or had found ways to avoid the security cameras, but careful review of surveillance footage revealed no evidence of living visitors entering the cemetery during overnight hours. The flowers appeared to materialize on graves between his patrol rounds, always arranged with care and attention that suggested deep emotional connections to the deceased, but placed by visitors who remained completely undetected by both Kevin's direct observation and the electronic security systems. Kevin began modifying his patrol schedule to include random timing and unexpected route changes, hoping to catch the mysterious flower placers in the act and solve what he assumed was a simple security breach caused by determined family members who had found ways to circumvent the cemetery's access controls. But his altered patrol patterns had no effect on the flower placement activity, and Kevin began finding evidence that the mysterious visitors weren't limiting their activities to simple grave decorations, but were engaged in more complex interactions with the burial sites throughout Millbrook Cemetery. He discovered that soil around certain graves had been carefully disturbed and replaced, leaving subtle signs that someone had been digging shallow holes near headstones before filling them back in and concealing the evidence of their excavation activities. Kevin found small personal items buried near headstones, including jewelry, photographs, and handwritten letters that appeared to have been placed as offerings or communications directed toward the deceased individuals buried at those locations, suggesting that the mysterious visitors were attempting to establish ongoing relationships with people who had been dead for years or decades. The items were always buried at precise depths and locations that indicated familiarity with cemetery protocols and burial practices, as if the people placing them understood the proper procedures for interacting with grave sites and had experience with cemetery operations that went beyond casual family visits. Kevin's observations during his second week at Millbrook Cemetery revealed phenomena that challenged his understanding of what was possible within the boundaries of rational experience, beginning with his encounter with what appeared to be a funeral procession moving through the cemetery grounds at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night when no services had been scheduled and no living people should have been present on the premises. The procession consisted of approximately 20 individuals dressed in formal funeral attire from various historical periods, carrying an ornate casket that seemed to glow with its own internal light as they moved silently along the main cemetery path toward the oldest section of burial grounds. Kevin observed the procession from behind a large mausoleum, using binoculars to study the participants who moved with purposeful coordination despite their translucent appearance and the fact that their feet made no sound as they walked across gravel paths that should have crunched audibly under their weight. The individuals in the procession displayed the facial features and clothing styles of people from different decades, some appearing to be from the 1940s and 1950s based on their hairstyles and formal wear, while others seemed to represent more recent time periods based on their modern funeral attire and contemporary appearance. Kevin realized that he was witnessing a gathering of deceased individuals from various eras of Millbrook Cemetery's history, all participating in a funeral ceremony for someone or something that required burial in the cemetery's oldest section, where the most prominent and influential community members had been interred during the cemetery's founding period. The casket they carried was unlike any modern funeral container Kevin had ever seen, appearing to be constructed from materials that seemed to shift and change in composition as the procession moved, sometimes appearing wooden, sometimes metallic, and occasionally seeming to be made of stone or crystal that refracted light in impossible ways. But the most disturbing aspect of the supernatural funeral procession was that the casket appeared to be empty, based on the way the pallbearers carried it with ease despite its substantial size and ornate construction, suggesting that they were conducting a funeral service for someone or something that had not yet died but was being prepared for burial in advance of their actual death. Kevin attempted to follow the procession to observe their destination and understand the purpose of their midnight ceremony, but found that he could not maintain visual contact with the group despite their slow, deliberate pace and his knowledge of the cemetery's layout and topography. The procession seemed to phase in and out of visibility, sometimes appearing solid and clearly defined, other times becoming translucent or disappearing entirely for several minutes before rematerializing in different locations within the cemetery grounds. When Kevin finally located the procession again, they had gathered around a specific grave in the oldest section of Millbrook Cemetery, where they appeared to be conducting a burial ceremony that involved lowering the empty casket into a grave that had been freshly excavated despite showing no signs of disturbance when Kevin had patrolled that area less than 2 hours earlier. The deceased participants in the funeral service spoke in voices that Kevin could hear but not understand, using words that sounded like English but contained syllables and inflections that seemed to belong to a language that had evolved beyond normal human communication, suggesting that death had changed not just their physical forms but their methods of expression and interaction. Kevin's investigation of the supernatural funeral procession led him to discover that the grave site where the ceremony had taken place was connected to an underground chamber system that extended beneath Millbrook Cemetery's oldest section, chambers that had been deliberately concealed from public knowledge and contained evidence of activities that explained why the cemetery required professional security services. Following strange vibrations and hollow sounds that seemed to originate from beneath the cemetery grounds, Kevin located a concealed entrance to the underground system hidden behind a maintenance shed that had been disguised to appear abandoned and unused by cemetery staff. The entrance led to a network of stone-lined chambers that had been carved into the bedrock beneath the cemetery, chambers that showed evidence of recent use despite their historical construction that appeared to date back to the cemetery's founding in the 1800s. The underground chambers contained evidence of live burials, including scratched walls where fingernails had gouged desperate messages into stone surfaces, scattered personal belongings that suggested people had been trapped in the chambers while still alive, and ventilation systems that had been designed to provide just enough air to sustain life for extended periods while preventing escape or communication with the surface world. Kevin discovered that the chambers had been used as a disposal system for people who had discovered inconvenient truths about cemetery operations or had threatened to expose corruption and illegal activities conducted by cemetery administrators and their associates in the community's power structure. The evidence suggested that live burial had been used as a method of elimination that left no obvious evidence of murder, while ensuring that victims couldn't testify about what they had witnessed or learned during their investigations into cemetery activities. Kevin found personal items and identification documents belonging to previous security guards, maintenance workers, and researchers who had been reported as missing persons but had actually been buried alive in the underground chamber system, when they had discovered evidence of the cemetery's dark secrets. The chambers included recently used sections that contained fresh evidence of live burials, suggesting that the elimination system remained active and that Kevin's own investigation had put him at risk of becoming the next victim to be disposed of through the underground burial chambers. But the most horrifying discovery came when Kevin found surveillance equipment in the chambers that had been used to monitor and record the final hours of live burial victims, equipment that was connected to viewing stations where cemetery administrators and co-conspirators had watched the elimination process as entertainment while documenting the effectiveness of their disposal methods. The recordings revealed that live burial victims had been kept conscious and aware during their entombment, forced to experience the full psychological and physical horror of being buried alive while their captors observed their suffering and recorded their final moments for future reference and pleasure. Kevin realized that the supernatural activity he had been witnessing at Millbrook Cemetery wasn't paranormal phenomena, but was the manifestation of extreme trauma and suffering experienced by people who had been murdered through live burial. In the underground chambers, their consciousness somehow persisting after death to continue trying to communicate the truth about what had happened to them and warn others about the ongoing danger. Kevin's final security report documented his plan to expose the live burial chamber system and the conspiracy that had been operating at Millbrook Cemetery for over a century. But his report was never submitted to authorities because Kevin Rodriguez disappeared during his final shift and became another victim of the elimination system he had discovered beneath the cemetery grounds. His investigation had revealed that the cemetery board, local government officials, and prominent community families had been using Millbrook Cemetery as a disposal site for inconvenient witnesses since the 1800s, eliminating anyone who threatened to expose their corruption, criminal activities, and abuse of power through the systematic torture of live burial in the underground chamber system. The supernatural funeral procession Kevin had witnessed was actually a gathering of previous victims who had been murdered in the chambers, their consciousness persisting after death to conduct burial ceremonies for future victims whose fate had already been decided by the conspiracy that controlled cemetery operations. Kevin had become a target for elimination when his security reports showed too much curiosity about the cemetery's unusual activities, and his modified patrol schedules had interfered with the conspirators' ability to conduct live burials without being observed by someone who might recognize the significance of what he was witnessing. The cemetery's requirement for security services hadn't been to protect the grounds from vandalism, but to identify and eliminate security guards who showed signs of discovering the underground chamber system before they could report their findings to outside authorities who weren't part of the conspiracy. Kevin's replacement found his final notes hidden in the security office, notes that revealed the locations of evidence that could expose the live burial operation and identify the community leaders who had been participating in the elimination conspiracy for multiple generations. But, like previous security guards who had uncovered the truth about Millbrook Cemetery, Kevin's replacement was faced with a choice between ignoring the evidence and becoming part of the cover-up, or investigating further and risking the same fate that had befallen every other person who had discovered the underground chamber system. The notes ended with Kevin's warning that the conspiracy had survived for over 150 years because it eliminated threats before they could expose the truth, and that anyone who learned about the live burial chambers would be marked for elimination, unless they found a way to expose the entire operation simultaneously to multiple authorities who couldn't all be compromised by the conspiracy's influence. Kevin's final words, scrawled in increasingly desperate handwriting, revealed that he had heard voices calling to him from the underground chambers during his last shift, voices of previous victims who were trying to warn him that his elimination had been scheduled and that he needed to escape from Millbrook Cemetery immediately if he wanted to avoid joining them in the live burial system that had claimed dozens of victims over the decades. But Kevin Rodriguez was never seen again after that final shift, and when investigators later searched for evidence of foul play, they found only his abandoned security uniform and equipment scattered near the concealed entrance to the underground chambers, along with fresh soil that suggested another burial had been completed during the overnight hours when no witnesses were present to document what had happened to the security guard who had learned too much about Millbrook Cemetery's darkest secrets. So ends our journey through 4 true accounts that reveal the thin barrier between life and death, and the dangerous secrets that some places harbor beneath their peaceful facades. If you found yourself holding your breath during these testimonies, perhaps you understand now why certain locations demand respect and why some mysteries are maintained through silence and fear. Like if the darkness feels closer now than when we began, subscribe so these warnings reach others who walk alone through places where the dead refuse to rest quietly. And remember that some truths follow you home, whether you invited them or not.